don't ask permission, ask forgiveness, but they're also terrified of the legal logistics of AI.
All right, everybody, welcome to an episode of Voices of the Industry. This week we have a special, not only guest, but also co-host. This week we have the infamous, the man of mystery himself, Sun Lu.
Hello.
And for our guest this week, we have someone who, admittedly, I dropped the ball. I haven't been in contact with this person as much as I should have been. It's been a while, but he's an awesome visual effects artist. I believe he's coming to us by way of Canada. This week we have Mr. Erik Johnson with us.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Appreciate having you, man. Yeah, so I don't know if you've been keeping track with our podcast. We've been bringing people on to talk about their experience being in the visual effects industry, offering some insight for people who may not know, may be curious, and may be wanting to go into the field themselves. We want to highlight people who we feel are often overlooked and give them a platform to express some thoughts they have, both positive and negative criticism. But for the most part, we want to keep working in this industry and we want to see it continue to grow and improve. And yeah, Erik, one question, I don't think we ever had this conversation ourselves, but want to have an idea of what got you into the visual effects industry.
Oh, yeah. I really wanted to go into video games. At first, I love video games and I still love video games. I still play way too many to this day.
Nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that. I always loved video games. And then I also grew up, I would have to say the movie that probably got me most interested in VFX was definitely the Lord of the Rings trilogy when that came out.
Oh, man.
I think for most of the people in my generation, I think for most millennials, Lord of the Rings was pretty much our Star Wars.
There we go. Tell them.
It is. It definitely is. I mean, we had a Star Wars trilogy of our own that came out around that period of time, but we much rather talk about the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Please.
Because that was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And that just blew my mind. I thought that was so cool. And that's kind of what made me more interested in going to film. And then things like, like Pirates of the Caribbean. Oh, especially the second one. Ooh. Davy Joe. Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Oh. Seeing Davy Jones on the big screen, that was pretty mind-blowing. I hadn't seen anything for a character looking that good on screen that you're like, oh, wow, this is a fake character. And it just was capturing all the emotions, right? It just didn't feel like it was in the uncanny valley.
Mm-hmm.
It was just amazing. So I originally wanted to be a chef before going to VFX.
What?
I used to be a not terrible cook. I'm not a good cook anymore because I don't cook anymore.
What?
But that used to be a big passion of mine. I was like, man, but I went to visit college for being a chef and I saw how terrible that life would be for me. I was like, I'm not an early morning person. I was looking at it. It was like all these chefs were waking up 5 a.m. to prep stuff.
Oh,
and you're like, oh no. I also wanted a better computer at that point. And I was like, well, how can I get into an industry where I can justify spending a lot on computers? It's like, oh man, I love computers. And I was really big into art. I did a lot of art photography in high school, a lot of sculpting. While photography and all that were interesting, I also kind of knew that would be kind of a harder industry to get into. There's just so many photographers out there. Around that point, digital photography was taking off. So everyone was kind of becoming a photographer. So it just kind of made that industry just a little too hard to want to break into. So I ended up going and checking out a place called Pratt Institute in New York and applying for their 3D animation and did that for 4 years. And afterwards, pretty much just started looking for work. And
here you are.
And here I am.
Erik, I have a very important question.
I'm looking forward to this question.
So, you know those late nights we were working?
I remember so many of them.
Yes. And they provided us cardboard pizza to incentivize us to stay.
Yeah.
So you're saying we could have had you catering for our team instead? You could have been cooking for us?
I mean, if we were okay with me not doing quota and stuff, maybe if we could have gotten an exemption for quota, I think I would have been okay with that. Then again, that was probably long enough afterwards. I would have been a little rusty and maybe not as good of a cook as I was when I was in high school.
Oh, I'm sure you could have done better than what was given for us.
I'm sure I could have beat Domino's, but you would not have gone out to cater at that point.
All right. That's my important question.
I'm glad that you asked that. It was very important.
No, it was, Sun. This is why we brought him on, ladies and gentlemen, because Sun asked the important questions that I failed to think of. But we're going to press on. So he talked about, the education that he had. How about the first studios that he got to work at?
Sure. I kind of started off the standard way that most people do. I did an internship in college, the standard internship that everyone does. So I worked for free in New York for a little bit. And then afterwards, I did some teaching for a little bit for a tech program called Internal Drive or ID Tech that does a lot of teaching around the country. They rent out universities during the summer and they teach things like Maya and Unreal Engine and stuff like that. So I did that for the summers for a few years. And then just freelance during the winters and did a bunch of stuff, just kind of working around local New York studios before moving to LA. Moved to LA around 2010. And then there, I did a little bit more teaching during the summers, but was mostly just doing short 2-3 week freelance things around LA before landing at Stereo D, which was my first long job after college. Because I was at Stereo D for almost 6 years, I'd say, before moving on. And after that point, I've been jumping around VFX houses, went to Mr. X, then to Scanline, then the Method, and then I've been at ILM for the last couple of years, well, 2.5.
Yeah, once we left the D, it's definitely that kind of experience of some of us for the first time becoming freelancers, contract artists. Because for a lot of people, that was their first gig in the industry. And in some cases, that was their only gig in the industry. Because, you know, it's not that easy for us to keep working in the field. But for those of us who managed to keep it going, you know, either you're really good or really lucky.
Props to the people who can keep it going.
I was really glad that Stereo D was not my very first after college experience. They preyed on your ability to be like, well, this is the job. It's like you've been here ever since. It's like you'll do anything to keep it.
Oh, wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge there.
Yeah. Yeah, so you talked about being in New York, then moving out to LA for work. And then you end up moving to Canada, right?
Yep. I live in Montreal currently right now.
Yeah. So what's that been like? I know sometimes people talk about just like culturally that impacts the work hours and just the overall work environment. So how is that different from working out here in the States?
Yeah, it's pretty similar. I mean, for what I'm doing now, it's a little weird because I work in Montreal for a Vancouver company. So I work from noon to 9 my time, which works for me because I am not a morning person. I hate mornings and I've always been really fond of night. So that worked out naturally, but it does make it a little bit weird because you can't do as much during the work week with friends and stuff like that. You're pretty much a weekend only person. For the work culture, it's pretty similar. I mean, it's the standard 40 hours a week. The hours you work a week can vary dependent on province. That's definitely the interesting thing about Canada. Canada is very segmented between the BC VFX scene, the Ontario, which is mostly Toronto VFX scene, and then the Quebec, Montreal VFX scene. They're very much individual parts and they have kind of their own work rules. Like in Vancouver or BC in general just has work hours that are very similar to California, that it's the standard 40-hour work week. And Montreal is like that as well. I believe BC might have 8-hour days and that you can get OT based off daily instead of weekly, but I'm not 100% sure on that. In general, it's weekly though for 40 hours, but in Ontario, it's 44 hours before you hit overtime. So a lot of times in Ontario, if you work more of a salaried position, you're salaried to 44. But otherwise, what they expect you to work, how much we actually work, it's pretty similar. I mean, definitely nothing like the good old Stereo D hours. I haven't pulled those hours since Burbank, but actually one of the cooler things about working in VFX, especially in Canada, is you do get to talk with people from all around the world. Like almost everyone you talk with is going to be from somewhere different. It's very uncommon to find someone that's just like, oh, when I was in Ontario, you talked to someone who was born and lived and raised in Ontario. It's like, nope, at the Toronto studios, it's like most of the people are from Europe or Asia or from the US at some point. It's a real mix of people. So when you talk with people, you get a really interesting view of the world. Because I'm not sure, especially like with how many other industries in general get that opportunity, that there's such global industries that just in your regular workplace, you can just effectively learn about the rest of the world super easily from other individuals.
Oh, Eric.
Yeah.
So I've been curious. There's been a lot of jobs leaving the US.
Yeah, there have.
Does Canada have like similar problems?
Canada's not doing super well in VFX at the moment. I mean, we're starting to see a little bit of that come back, kind of like everyone, but it definitely isn't the same as the problems in the US. There's way more availability of work. There's just so many more projects available in Canada.
Oh, interesting.
I mean, you still have outsourcing to other places. Like Australia is starting to become pretty big at the moment. I can't remember which province Sydney's in, But the province in Australia, I know, has a higher tax credit right now. I know a lot of work is going to Australia right now. Vancouver, of course, still has a really good one. You still have to compete against the global tax credits, but they still have enough competitive tax credits in places like BC and that to keep work coming there. And even the provinces kind of pull work from each other. Like when Montreal was taken off, they were effectively killing jobs and closing a couple of studios in Vancouver and then moved them over to Montreal for their tax benefits because it was just a little bit cheaper.
Goodness.
BC is probably one of the more stable. BC and UK. There's definitely slowness and a lot of studio closures have occurred in Canada. Or mostly it's been a lot of larger companies kind of consolidating down some of their stuff. Like Framestore technically closed Vancouver, but it wasn't. Framestore had just bought Method. So technically it was Method Vancouver they were closing down. But Framestore already has a Montreal studio. So effectively it's just kind of consolidating down to less locations. That's been pretty big in Canada. Or something like MPC, like I used to work for Mr. X. Mr. X was owned by Technicolor. And Technicolor owned 3 VFX houses. They owned MPC, Mr. X, and The Mill. And then they also owned Micros Animation. But effectively at one point, they kept the 3 separate for a little while. And then around the time that Cats occurred, because The Mill film was working on, I believe Cats was one of their last projects before they got merged into MPC, because Technicolor just decided they didn't want to have 3 competing VFX companies under their umbrella anymore and merged everything to MPC. So things like Mr. X Toronto became MPC Toronto. There's 2 MPC locations in Canada that are really big. So you have like Toronto, which was former Mr. X, and then things like MPC Montreal, which is a main MPC branch. But effectively, they're both MPC now, even though they're kind of somewhat different studios. Though I think they're the same pipeline internally now.
Yeah, so the consolidating makes a lot of sense. It sucks because a lot of artists are going to lose their jobs, but
yeah,
from a business side, it's like, yeah, man, like you said, we are one company. Now we own 3 of the same thing. We only need 1, right?
Yeah.
Just consolidate it down. So that's why it's tough. I mean, I think we might have a segment. Our son and I talked about it. Our brave souls who want to look into their own startup, which we highly discourage, but yeah, people want to do it.
Hey, if you got a bunch of money you want to waste, that sounds like a good way to do it.
I know you made a comment before we hopped on off air about the differences that you notice between bigger studios and smaller studios. So I was wondering if you wanted to just kind of give some insight of what those differences are.
Oh, yeah. Definitely the biggest thing in smaller studios, you definitely wear a lot more hats. It's kind of enjoyable because you'll often be able to work kind of in other departments a little bit, especially if a department starts falling behind. It's something like, oh man, yeah, it's like the effects for this is taking a little bit too long, but it's something like we need to get this shot out today. And it's like, well, we can just do that. It's like, we only have a few people in comp. It's like, well, we can try going through, seeing if we can find a comp solution for this. Finding comp solutions is way more common the smaller the studio it is. You definitely have to get a lot more creative with having to do problem solving, since a lot more relies on what you're doing, and you can't be as much in a much larger studio unless it's like a minor fix. It's much more likely like, oh man, if did something get rendered out wrong into the lighting pass, it's like, well, that's going to go back to lighting then at a larger studio, because they really don't want to have the department spend time on things that the other departments are working on.
Mm-hmm.
You're much more specialized in the large studio. If you're hired for comp, you will be very much, that's what you do. Maybe there'll be a few other opportunities if there's a little bit of free time, but there's so many projects going on and there's just so much work that it's just like, you need to get it through each department, and each department has to have accountability for that department. While with the smaller studios, you're talking much earlier to people in FX, or larger studios, you're still talking to people like FX and lighting before you get it as well. But you're definitely planning the shots out a little bit more. You're doing a little more of like, oh, well, I think we might be able to hit this in comp first. And they're much more willing to try a comp approach at a small studio, because it will save them from some of the heavier departments. Because a smaller studio is studios in general are almost always going to have more compositors than other departments, but especially in a smaller studio where you just have a smaller overhead. If other departments start falling behind, you have to drag in people from further on departments to effectively help out. But it also gives you a lot more opportunities to try out different things that you may not be able to in a larger studio where you're very much specialized, especially like in a smaller studio, you're going to be doing a lot more paint fix and you're going to be doing a lot more roto cleanup. In a larger studio, if it's going to take you more than like an hour to do any paint fix, you send that back to the place, send you the paint outs and that.
That is true. Yeah, working at certain places, I didn't notice that they really wanted to keep you set on what they brought you in to do. Unless you're getting trained up and you're moving to another department, they want you specialized in whatever that department is. And yeah, small studio, yeah, man. First studio was that somehow I became the only artist at one point, and yeah, I had to like figure out how to do everything. Whether it was motion graphics, 3D, comp, I mean, like they're like, Mike, figure it out. Like, okay. And if you really can't figure something out, we'll bring in someone else to help you out who was more specialized, or another person who was just as much of a generalist as I was, since it was a small place. I guess the view is it's more efficient to some degree. Yeah. Like that's what it's supposed to do. Have them fix it. Every department's always swamped, I guess.
Yeah.
Trying to work on stuff. So no, that's good. Yeah, it's definitely a solid difference between the two.
Yeah, and the small studios can be more fun because of that. You just have a lot more variety of type of work usually, just because I have to come up with creative solutions to some of your problems because they're not going to go back to a previous department to get fixed.
Yeah, and the funny thing with VFX, it kind of works backwards, right? It's like the more hats you wear, sometimes the less they want to pay you. But the more specialized you are, you could really kind of up the charge of your worth, which is why we have studios that I know when I was working, like it was like over a decade ago when I first started, there was so much talk of like a studio like ILM maybe getting acquired because those were like the prime artists in the industry. Like those guys were making top dollar, not only like a lot of innovators also in those teams, but yeah, they were like the best at what they did. Like they were highly specialized modelers, effects artists, animators. I know at one point I heard someone saying like, yo, someone's going to buy these guys one day because it's so expensive to keep those artists on board.
Yep.
But they're worth it.
Or you go to Canada where we have tax credits and 40% of the artist pay is paid by the government.
Well, that's interesting.
There we go, US. That's amazing. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's why every CW show is filmed in Canada.
Yeah. That is the main reason Canada and London are the main VFX hubs and are as stable as they are.
Mm-hmm.
It's unfortunate, but yeah, it's about 40% of, I don't know how it works for each province for it, because technically it's how much you spend in the province. It's like some of them are based off if you do production there. So a lot of times they'll film in the same place of doing the VFX to get the extra credit. But almost all VFX that's done for streaming, I'd say that's done for mostly streaming or film, is probably going to be UK, Canada, or India, or usually the UK or Canada, and then support from India, because every studio has an India studio now. To pretty much survive in the industry, you need an India studio.
Well, that's an interesting dynamic.
How so, Mr. Liu?
Oh, no, it's just an observation. Because like we used to be able to not rely on outsourcing, right? Like we didn't need it. But now studios are outsourcing to maximize their profits. But now studios have to rely on outsourcing to survive.
Yeah, it's the weird thing. I think inflation rates have impacted everyone, regardless of what you do, you know, from the grocery store to things you order online to everything. You know, we realized that somehow we got to a weird place where demand keeps growing, but you got to keep cutting overhead to supply the demand, right? As a consumer, we always think that corporations just want to get richer. They want to increase percentage every single year, but the cost of everything in general keeps going up. So there becomes like a drive down. I mean, some studios, like depending on where you work, you would see it. But I know where I was, you know, the first studio I ever worked at, 9K9, who's defunct now. My boss, he was constantly all about like, how can we underbid our competitors more and more and more? Because we were a startup. So it's like, how do we steal work from them? How do we win the bid? And he always come to me like, all right, Mike, I know you just got out of school, but it's your job to do work that's as good and competitive as guys 8 years your senior, because we got to drive down the cost. So I need you to be as good as them, even though you have like no experience. And over the few months, I learned how to do really good photoreal rendering and comp and stuff. But I was like forced to. There was this pressure. But it's because there is this kind of incentive to see like who can do a better job for less. Because there was no like real regulation of how this stuff was. In some houses, because they were trying to outbid each other, they were just trying to get work. It was all about who can do it for less. So there was that going on its own.
Mm-hmm.
It's completely separate from economics. It was just people who were just trying to get an edge on others, trying to say, how can I do a better job for less money? So that's always an incentive sometimes that doesn't help anybody, but it's because none of it's standardized. There's no standardized, like, this is how much this type of work is worth. And I think because VFX studios didn't unionize for so long, you had conflicting rates for things. There was no set, like, this is how much it's worth. I think that's one aspect of it. I mean, I think there's a lot of factors as to why outsourcing has increased. I think some of this stuff people realize you just need a lot of bodies to just get it done. Like Roto, you need dozens of people on a team, depending on how crazy the shot is, to get everything roto. And what easier way than to use a country that has a ton of bodies that they could just throw at anything, which is India. They got really efficient and good at stuff. I mean, I remember there would be clean plates we would send to India before we had to send them to Korea. Like before, they were like the premier clean plate studios, but now India does good clean plates as well. Where we would ask them just to paint out, just remove the car, and we're going to put in a CG car, because sometimes they like to do that for car commercials. Now I think it's a little bit different. They don't have to. But before, they would use a temp car to film the commercial spot. And then we will put in the updated car that's going to be a CG car later. When you do heavy outsourcing, it's a toss-up at how much iterations you're going to need. People who know. Yeah, but some of them got really good, man. So I'm not surprised that Erik brought up the fact that like every studio now has a dedicated India studio, because even the demand, I mean, dude, the fact that we see Bollywood films brought up in our box office now, thanks to lockdowns, people started to watch a ton of international films. Some of them happen to be these crazy Bollywood films from India. And yeah, dude, now there's like a high demand for them to continue to have better artists over there, because the entire world is now checking out their film.
Yeah, and actually a lot of the VFX or the big Bollywood ones that are coming over here are actually done outside of India. Like DNEG does a lot of the VFX for their Bollywood films in Canada still, or UK as well. I don't know if it still exists, but it existed like a year or two ago, called Redefine. That speciality was Bollywood VFX. I don't believe they were based in India. I'm not 100% sure. DNEG merged with Prime Focus, but I think they're now saying that DNEG brought Prime Focus, but I thought it was the other way around. I've seen people confused. I don't know. It might be like an economic inversion technique. Who knows? But Prime Focus and DNEG are kind of one right now.
Yeah, I'm not going to get too into that. Just know that India studios are owned by India. No American studio is allowed to own an India studio. And I'll just leave it at that. Infer the rest as you will.
Yep, exactly. Also, I just want to add an addendum to one of the things we were talking about before. Technically, every studio doesn't have an India studio, but they're very likely to outsource some of what they have, especially Paint and Roto is almost guaranteed to be India for almost every studio. But a smaller studio might not have an India studio. Like a mid-sized studio of like 200 people very likely might not actually have an India studio, but they will outsource to Indian vendors for especially Roto and Paint and maybe some light comp work.
For sure. Now it's just part of the culture. It's an international market. Like that's just how everything's built and structured, because it's just way cheaper to just offload whatever type of work elsewhere and have other type of work that needs to be specialized, especially supervisor or more very like specialized skills are still based here in the US and in Canada and all the European countries. But yeah, definitely if it's something where, again, if you just got like, it just takes a lot of manual labor to just get something done, yeah, that's going to be outsourced to some place like India and whatnot.
I'm super curious to see how AI changes, especially the Indian landscape. It seems like AI is having a lot of disrupt, especially with a lot of the studios that do paint work.
Yeah, talk about it. So what do you think with AI? Like, how do you see that potentially changing things up?
There's a lot of ways this could go. We're still early enough in it that there's no way I can make any prediction. For some disciplines, I'm not terribly worried about AI. I think AI has had kind of a really strong initial push. Things like Copycat and Nuke are AI tools I've seen in use that are very good and work well in a production setting. It's a setup that works very well for doing paint cleanup and speeding up the paint cleanup process drastically. And a lot of the work outsourced to India would be paint work. So I know there's been a lot of layoffs in India recently at some of those studios.
No.
But for just overall, I mean, I guess it heavily depends on how good something like Sora can be. At no point do I think Sora or any of the other video generators or any of the text to image engines are going to become good enough, especially for streaming feature film. We have seen AI a little bit in commercials. I don't know if you guys have seen the Toys R Us commercial that they did recently. I mean, it looks okay. It's definitely not amazing looking, but it's the very first thing I've seen production-wise by a company. Because almost everyone in the industry, like all the major studios, they want to use AI to cut costs, but they're also terrified of the legal logistics of AI, because that's going to be the thing that probably determines most how AI gets rolled out in the future. Is there's so many lawsuits currently against OpenAI, NVIDIA, Microsoft, and all of that about scraping intellectual property. It's something that technically, if ruled against, it might require them to close down those products. I don't think that's going to happen. I think what's more likely is that for some of the bigger places like Disney and all of that, that have a lot of intellectual property, they will probably end up paying those companies for their intellectual property that they've already scraped. Don't ask permission, ask forgiveness. That's the best way to describe what the generative AI companies are doing. Comp will probably become a little more of a generalist department. I could see how AI could especially affect departments like FX. Those are really generally safe departments at the moment, but I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the stuff that we use FX for that are especially less hero shots, like stuff from like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, or like that long shot Weta did, like that super long hallway shot where it was like 2 or 3 minutes of heavy CG and stuff exploding and like Rocket and Groot are running around, like FX for that kind of thing. I don't think AI will ever be good enough to do that. But I think you'll see, especially in a lot more locked off shots, I've seen enough Gen AI stuff that you can effectively generate your own elements in comp. I could see being a thing. I would not be surprised to see something where you could do something like, oh, I want smoke that's blowing towards the screen and has a little bit of a twirl. And then effectively you generate 20 or 30 different images. I wouldn't be surprised to see effectively kind of like replace element libraries in general at studios. That instead of having all of that stuff where you're like, well, I've got to go through these thousands of elements and see if I can find the right element that will work for this shot. You're like, well, I can just kind of create or I get the general thing that I want, and then it will be good enough that in comp, I can fix everything that I need to, stencil out, mat everything I need to make it look good. And it would be effectively indistinguishable. I think you'll see that mostly take over things, though, that it's just like, oh man, we need particles in the background, or it's like we need additional smoke or something like that. Like in Godzilla, like the nuclear explosion. I don't see Gen AI doing that anytime soon, good enough to a degree that you could do it in a feature film or an actual streaming show or a high budget streaming show. The full video stuff, I don't see getting good enough. And it is also starting to sound like it's in a logarithmic kind of problem that effectively they had a lot of growth, but now they have to train on so much data to get any percentage better that it's not worth it. But I've only heard of those reports from people from effectively studies that don't have the access to AI wealth that Google or Microsoft would have, where they can have hundreds of thousands of NVIDIA GPUs. So no one's sure on scale if it will be as linear of a growth as it's been, or if it's effectively plateaued. And I'm starting to see signs that it has kind of plateaued, because up until like the start of 2024 or so, it just felt like image generation was moving very fast. It went from being really bad to really good in like a year and a half period. It's still really good, but it's definitely not getting past some of the hurdles that I kind of would have expected it to be at this point. Looking at it like a year ago, it definitely seemed like AI could almost kind of do anything. You could effectively say like, oh man, yeah, it's like we had the early AI image stuff. Of course, you have stuff like Sora came out in like March and stuff like that, but I'm not seeing much development or iteration on top of them. So I'm not seeing things like we went from Mid-Journey like 1 to 2 to 3 really quickly. I'm not seeing us going from like a Sora version 1 to a Sora version 2 anytime soon. It seems like we're slowing down how much effectively innovation is occurring with AI at the moment. Consistency is definitely the big problem for the video AI. The moment anything includes anything, it just becomes something else half the time.
Yeah, it might just be taking much longer because they're actually generating several frames for video and trying to keep it consistent.
I've seen progress made on it so that they've had effectively in controlled scenarios. I've seen some good stuff from AI where they've been able to keep consistency. but it does seem like it's very controlled scenarios and it's only very specific things that keep consistency. You would need that consistency throughout to make it into an actual shipping product. So I think you're going to see a lot of YouTube shorts, TikTok stuff with Sora on that. But I think that's probably about as far as it's going to get anytime in the near future. I mean, again, it all depends on what goes on with lawsuits, regulations, and how much companies are able to push stuff. And I mean, you're hitting power problems now with AI. So now they have to figure out how to solve being able to power all of the GPUs that they need. Seems like Microsoft and that are starting to look more at like they might become power companies at some point as well.
Speaking of AI, Eric, where you're at, like on the floor among the artists, is there like general concern about AI, or like are people excited, or what's going on there?
I would say general sentiment for AI is more on the concern side than enthusiasm.
Like, are people actively talking about it?
Oh, yeah, no, we definitely have AI forums. I mean, we've been doing machine learning for years, and that's all the AI that we're doing now is anyways. It's just we create a fancy name for machine learning to make it sound cooler. With copycat and that they have a new, I mean, it's the new diffusion algorithms for doing it. But I mean, we've been doing machine learning for 10, 15 years now for stuff. I mean, deep fakes are machine learned, and those were big like 5-6 years ago. Those are all forms of machine learn. It's just we now have machine learn with so much processing power and learned off just the general internet. That's definitely the newest thing about the current AI is it's the first generally machine learn you're doing off of stuff like your own intellectual property, or you have a much smaller data set that you can actually train on. So it's only viable to a certain degree.
Speaking of deepfakes, have you guys seen that new Eminem interview he did where he's like interviewing himself? Yeah, Slim Shady and Marshall Mathers interviewing each other about Eminem. It was all deepfaked, and man, that was rough to watch. I mean, I don't think Marvin's gotten around to seeing it, which I'm surprised because he's a bigger Eminem fan than I am. But just watching it, it was so rough looking. It was jittery. For some reason, they were doing like some really bad garbage roto around his head. And I'm just looking at this thinking, hey, he should have called up Lola. First and foremost, to do some solid facial replacement and de-aging. That would have been amazing if they actually hired the right vendor. Instead, he hired an AI-based, where they do deepfake videos and stuff. And just looking at it, I'm just like, should have asked for a refund. There were certain shots from certain angles, dead on, look great. And other times, it just looked really rough, really janky. And of course, to kind of help with it, they kind of did this glitchy effect on him to play with it, which they came up with some cool ideas and visuals for it. But at the same time, I'm like, yeah, like, but that glitchy effect is to hide how like rough this whole thing looks. Oh man. So seeing that was like, whew, okay, cool. Like we're still far and away. Because this is something done very recently and the whole thing looks rough.
There's a couple of companies that do kind of real-time deep fakes. I'm kind of curious if it's that kind of thing. Because I'm surprised that it looks that bad of deep fakes if it went through, especially like comp or something. It's like, that's where we're supposed to fix that. That's how we do a lot of digital doubles nowadays, or a lot of deep fakes. So do a lot of comp in those on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, deepfakes have come a long way. But he's been doing some deepfakes in his recent videos to promote this concept of him going retro, in his heyday. So there's a lot of deepfake stuff. And I'm assuming he's using the same deepfake studio he did for Houdini, but Houdini looked way better than this interview. But the interview was like 15 minutes. So I'm just guessing it was just too much to do, probably within like maybe like a month or two. I think the turnaround was just way too quick. I think you and I talked about it, son, like the difference between the de-aging they did on Luke Skywalker for the end of Mandalorian versus like the newer season. Or the newer season, like, man, he looks immaculate. As long as he's not talking and he's just standing there, Luke Skywalker looks lifelike just as he did back in the 70s. But at the end of Mandalorian, where they do that reveal, I'm like, oh my God, it's Luke Skywalker. Man, that whole thing looks super rough.
Oh, yeah.
It looked like they had 2 weeks. But they were doing a very rough deep fake as opposed to their full-on expensive process, which takes like 2 months. So to me, it was like 2 weeks versus 2 months. Like, this is the quality you can get.
I don't know how they did the season one. I know more about the process for season 2 because I worked on the ABBA concert experience, and I know we had the same setup as they did for doing the real life stuff. But I don't think I could go very much in detail about it, though.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, but if you check out Corridor Crew, yeah, they did show the process and they did deep fake it And so they did like a shortcut where they tried to train the algorithm within as much time as they could and then did the shots.
I don't know how they did the first one, but yeah, the second one is a very in-depth process with full CG and deepfakes on top of that.
Yeah, so if that's it, I guess we could wrap things up. Any final words you want to impart on the people regarding the visual effects industry?
I have no idea. There's so much you could say and so many different things. So I'm not going to free form flow speak everything about the industry.
Oh man, you're not going to do some slam poetry? We're going to take it back to the 90s.
If Sun gives me a beat, maybe.
Oh, jeez.
Oh, snap.
Well, we know that'll never happen then.
Nah, man. It was great catching up. Appreciate having a conversation with you, man. We'll definitely keep in touch and keep chatting about, where you're at, how things are going. And yeah, if you have any insights on other things happening in the industry that you want to speak on, you could definitely, have another sit down, talk about stuff as things develop, whether it be AI, whether it be another strike happens out of nowhere.
Oh God, there better be no more strikes.
We get like some random other dog, chimpanzee, parrot sickness thing that spreads like wildfire, whatever it may be. We appreciate having this network of people that we keep in contact with, and it helps keep us sane, when the industry gets wild and crazy.
Yeah, we're definitely in the most wild and crazy part of the industry I have ever seen.
Yeah, right now it's just like a toss-up. We don't know how things are going to go. I think that's probably the reason why I'm having these sit-downs with people to just, some people it's therapeutic to kind of sit and just kind of be like, man, it's been a rough year. I know some people might be tired of me bringing people on and talk about stuff. But part of it too is like, hey man, we have our concerns, we have maybe some squabbles or grievances, but for the most part, it's like, to reiterate the fact that this is the career path that we chose. We want to stick it out. We want to ride it till the sunset for as long as we can. And we do it because, it's what we like to do. We're passionate people, right? And, who knows? Next thing you know, we might be rolling up on Erik's future restaurant.
Oh God, no. Yeah.
You never know, man.
Yeah, you never know. It's like it's my fallback.
Frozen pizza pies ready to serve at a moment's notice. No, I'm kidding.
I'll microwave the best pizzas.
Do you Uber?
What about Uber?
Do you Uber? Can I order online?
Jack up the prices for Uber, though.
Ah, what about a special friend discount?
Non-Uber it isn't, because it's Uber. You're screwing over my business on Uber. If you were my friend, you would order from the restaurant directly.
Oh, okay.
Ooh.
Ooh. Oh.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for Sunlu for co-hosting with me, showing me how it's done.
Oh gosh.
I hope you guys get to hear more of him. Who knows? Maybe he'll be replacing me for this segment. I don't know. Tune in and find out. Until then, thanks everybody for tuning in, and be sure to check out the next one.